There is a hillside east of a city on the Tigris where a man once built himself a shelter out of whatever was lying around, and sat down under it, and waited for the place to burn. The city was still standing. That was the problem. He was a prophet. He had walked through those streets, delivered the message he was given, and watched the whole city believe him. Now he was outside the wall in the heat, asking God to take his life. And the thing that finally broke him was not the city at all. It was a plant. That hillside comes at the end. The start of it is a long way west, in a harbor town on the Mediterranean coast, with the same man counting out coins for a ticket. He had been given an instruction: go to that city. There was no confusion about the wording and no long stretch of praying it over. He heard it, and he walked the other direction. For a while, it worked. There was a ship at the dock, loading for a run about as far west as the known world went. He had the fare. Nobody stopped him at the plank. Nobody asked him where he was really going. No door slammed shut. No voice came down out of the sky. He paid. He boarded. He went below, and he found a place to lie down. If you had been standing on that dock watching him leave, you would have said the man was having a good day. Then the wind started. Hold on to one thing before the storm, because almost every telling of this story gets it backward. This is not a story about a man who did not know what God wanted. There is no scene anywhere in this book where he asks for clarity. He never requests a sign, never goes looking for a second opinion, never says the instruction was unclear, or the timing was bad, or the assignment belonged to somebody more qualified. The command lands, and one verse later he is walking toward the coast with money in his hand. He knew. That was the whole trouble. Plenty of people know exactly what they are supposed to be doing. The problem was never a shortage of information. So the question this book is actually asking is a harder one, and it takes a while to notice that the book is asking it at all. The question is not why he ran. It is what he was running from. Those are two different questions. And the answer to the second one is the single strangest thing in the story. Because he does not give it up. Not on the dock. Not in the storm. Not while the sailors are shouting at him. Not in the fish. And not on the road afterward. And not in the city. He holds it for 4 chapters. The book of Jonah keeps a secret about its own main character until the last few pages. And then he says it out loud himself. In one sentence. And everything before it changes shape. Everything you are about to hear is built on top of that sentence. But before the ticket, before the harbor, before any of it, there is a question worth asking about the man buying the fare. Who was he? Because he was not a nobody, and he was not a beginner. His name was Jonah, son of Amittai, and he came from a village called Gath-Hepher. You can find the spot. It sat in the hill country of Lower Galilee, in the tribal territory of Zebulun, a few miles northeast of a village that would later be called Nazareth. Small place, farming country, olives and grain, stone houses, a view of the ridges. Centuries later, travelers were still being shown a tomb there and told it belonged to him. Nothing about that village suggests a man headed for the far end of the Mediterranean. Now, the book of Jonah tells you almost nothing about him. 4 chapters. And it never says how old he was, whether he had a wife, what he did for a living before any of this, or what he looked like. It gives you a name, a father, and a command, and then it starts moving. But he appears one other time in the Hebrew Bible, in a single verse, in a different book entirely. And that verse changes how the whole story reads. The 2nd book of Kings, in the 14th chapter, is running through the reigns of the kings of the northern kingdom. It gets to a king named Jeroboam. the second one by that name, and it records something he accomplished. He restored the borders of Israel, from the entrance of Hamath in the north down to the Sea of the Arabah in the south. The territory came back. The maps got redrawn in Israel's favor for the first time in generations. And then the verse says how that was known in advance. It happened according to the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, which he spoke through his servant Jonah, son of Amittai, the prophet from Gath-Hepher. Same name, same father, same village. So sit with what that means. Before the harbor and the ticket, this man had a career. He was a working prophet in the northern kingdom, and the word he delivered was that the nation was going to expand. He predicted good news for his own country, and the good news came true, and everybody watched it come true. The borders moved. The land came back. That is about as good as the job gets. We are somewhere in the first half of the 8th century before Christ here, and the exact dates are argued over, so hold the numbers loosely. But the shape of that period is not in dispute. Jeroboam II sat on the throne for roughly 40 years, and it was the wealthiest stretch the northern kingdom ever had. Trade routes, building projects, ivory inlay in the houses of the rich, which we know because a prophet named Amos was standing in that same kingdom in that same generation, complaining about it. Jonah was not a voice in the wilderness. He was a national figure in a country that was doing well, and his track record said so. There is a detail sitting in that verse in 2 Kings that is worth slowing down for, because it is easy to read past. The passage says Jeroboam II did evil in the sight of the Lord. It says so plainly, a few lines earlier. And then it says God restored the borders anyway, because he saw the affliction of Israel, and it was bitter, and there was nobody to help them. The mercy in that passage went to people who had not earned it, and the man God used to announce it was Jonah. Keep that in your pocket. Nobody points at it, and the book of Jonah never mentions it, and we are not going to hammer it. But it is there, in the only other verse in the Bible with his name in it. So here is the man standing at the start of this story, a prophet with a resume, a man who had delivered a word from God before and been proven right in public, somebody who knew exactly what it felt like to hear the voice, carry the message, and watch it land. He had done the job. He was good at it, and every assignment he had ever taken pointed inward, toward his own people, his own borders, his own nation's survival. Then the word came again, and it pointed the other way. The book opens with it, and it opens fast. There is no vision described, no template, no burning coal, no scene in the throne room of heaven. Other prophets get commissioning stories that run for a full chapter. Jonah gets one line, dropped without any setup at all. The way you would report the weather. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Get up, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, because their wickedness has come up before me. Get up, go, cry out against it. 3 commands, and none of them soften. He had spent a career speaking to his own countrymen. Now he was being sent out of the country entirely, to a city he had never seen, to say something against it out loud in the street. And the name of that city is the part that mattered, because every person hearing this story in the ancient world already knew what Nineveh was. They did not need it explained. The name did all the work by itself. And it did the same work a handful of place names still do today. The kind you say once in a room and watch the temperature drop. We do not have that reflex anymore. Nineveh has been a ruin for a very long time. So, before the ticket, before Joppa, before the storm, we need to go stand in that city while it was still standing, and find out what those people did, because they wrote it down themselves. Nineveh sat on the east bank of the Tigris, in the northern part of what is now Iraq, across the river from the modern city of Mosul. It was old, before Jonah was born. People had been living on that ground for thousands of years already, and there had been a temple to the goddess Ishtar there for most of them. By the time this story takes place, Nineveh was one of the major cities of the Assyrian Empire, and within a century, it would be the capital, the largest city on earth, ringed by a wall you could drive a chariot along the top of. The empire it belonged to had one defining feature, and it was not architecture. Assyria ran the most effective war machine the ancient Near East had produced. Standing army rather than seasonal levies. Zieg engines, battering rams under wheeled sheds. Engineers who could cut through a city wall while archers on towers cleared the defenders off the top of it. Cavalry that could cross country faster than word of their coming. And a policy of deportation. When a city resisted, Assyria did not just take it. They emptied it. They marched the survivors hundreds of miles and dropped them somewhere else, mixed them in with strangers, and moved other people into the ground they had left. It broke a nation's memory of itself. Populations that got that treatment did not come back as populations. Now, most of what a nation's enemies say about it should be taken with some suspicion. History gets written by the side that survives, and the losers exaggerate. That is what makes Assyria different. The worst things we know about them, we know because they carved it on their own walls. On purpose, to be admired. Assyrian kings kept annals. They wrote up their campaigns and had the accounts inscribed on stone slabs and clay prisms and the walls of their own palaces. In the royal voice, first person, these were not confessions. They were advertising, and archaeologists have been pulling them out of the ground since the 1800s. One king describes building a pillar in front of a conquered city gate and covering it with the skin of the men who had led the resistance. Others describe flaying prisoners, impaling bodies on stakes around a captured town, cutting off hands and noses and ears, burning young men and women in a fire, and heaping severed heads into piles at the city gate, where everyone coming and going would have to walk past them. Palace reliefs show it, rows of carved stone, meant to be seen by visiting officials and foreign envoys, with the work of the army laid out in careful detail. You can go look at them in museums in London and Paris and Chicago right now. The point of writing all that down was not record-keeping. It was mail. Send the accounts out. Let the reliefs be described by everyone who saw them. And the next city on the list might open its gates without a fight. Terror was cheaper than a siege, and Assyria understood that better than anybody in the region. The specific claims in those inscriptions are royal propaganda, and scholars argue about how much of any single campaign is exaggerated. Kings inflate their numbers, but the argument is over the scale, not the practice, and there is no version of Assyria in which these people were misunderstood. That was the city Jonah was told to walk into and cry out against. And there is one more piece. And this is the piece that turns his refusal from a tantrum into something you can feel. Israel already knew what Assyria did, because Assyria had already been to Israel. Assyrian kings had been collecting tribute from the region for over a century by the time of this story. There is a black limestone monument, found in the 1800s and now in the British Museum, that shows an Israelite king on his knees with his face to the ground in front of an Assyrian king. The inscription names him Yehu, from the northern kingdom, Jonah's kingdom. A few generations before Jonah, an Israelite king on the ground with his forehead in the dirt, carved in stone, on display in an Assyrian city. That was the relationship. And now run the timeline forward instead of backward. Jonah was working in the reign of Jeroboam II, when the borders were expanding and the money was good, and the northern kingdom looked stronger than it had in generations. That prosperity was resting on a temporary weakness in Assyria. And the weakness did not last. Within about 40 years of Jeroboam's death, Assyrian armies were back in force. They took the Galilee. They took the land east of the Jordan. They deported the population in waves. And in the year 722 before Christ, they finished it. The capital, Samaria, fell after a siege of about 3 years. The northern kingdom of Israel ceased to exist as a nation. Permanently, its people were scattered across the empire and never returned as a people. Gath-Hepher, Jonah's village, was in the Galilee. It went in the first wave. Now the exact dates here are debated and the sequence is reconstructed from several sources. So hold the numbers with some care. But the outcome is not in dispute. The empire Jonah was sent to warn is the empire that erased his country from the map. He almost certainly did not live to see it. But he did not need to see it to know which direction the weather was coming from. Anybody with eyes on that border could do the arithmetic. So stop for a second and look at the assignment honestly. A man from a small village in the Galilee is told to travel 500 miles to the capital city of the army that has been extorting his people for a century. An army that advertises what it does to captured towns, and to stand up in the street there and deliver a word from God. That is not an inconvenient errand. That is not a hard job that a braver person would have taken. There is a version of this story where Jonah is a coward, and it is the version most people carry around. And it is too small. It makes him a child who did not want to do his homework. Whatever was actually going on in that man. And it turns out to be stranger than fear. The assignment itself was legitimately terrible. Something worth saying plainly before we go on. Reading this does not put you inside the head of 8th century Israel. And it should not turn into a lesson about which modern people we get to compare Assyria to. That is not what this is for. What it is for is understanding a man on a dock, buying passage in the opposite direction, so that you stop wondering why he ran. He ran because any sane person would have wanted to. That is what makes what he says at the end of the book so hard to hear. Put the two destinations on a map, because the geography of this decision is doing something that a casual reading walks straight past. Nineveh is northeast, from the hill country of Galilee. You would travel up through Syria, cross to the Euphrates, follow the river, road, east and north, and come down to the Tigris, roughly 500 miles of it by the practical routes, some of that through desert, with the last stretch running through the heart of Assyrian territory. Weeks of walking. Merchants did it. Caravans did it. It was a known road with known stops. Tarshish is the other way. Nobody can tell you with certainty where Tarshish was. And anyone who is certain has gone further than the evidence goes. The strongest candidate has always been the far southwest of Spain, in the region the Greeks later called Tartessos, near where the Guadalquivir River runs out into the Atlantic. Phoenician traders were working that coast for metals. Silver, tin, lead. There are other proposals, including places in the western Mediterranean and even in the eastern part of it. But the direction is never in question. Tarshish is west. In the Hebrew Bible, it functions as the edge of the map, the far end of the sea, the place you name when you want to say as far as ships go. So look at what he bought. He did not take a shorter assignment. He did not go home to Gath-Hepher and wait it out. He did not travel a little way and stop, given a command pointing northeast by land. He went to the coast and purchased passage to the westernmost place a person could purchase passage to. If Tarshish is where most scholars think it is, that is roughly 2,000 miles of open sea in the wrong direction, 4 times the distance he had been asked to walk. He was not drifting. He was not avoiding. This was a decision that took planning, money, and a specific choice of ship. And the text says something about it that most translations render as fleeing from the presence of the Lord. twice, in one verse, which raises an obvious problem, because Jonah is a prophet, and he will state his own theology out loud in a few pages. And it is completely orthodox. He knows God made the sea. He is not a man who thinks the God of Israel stops at the coastline. The best sense of the phrase is probably something closer to walking out of the room, not escaping God's knowledge, resigning from his service, getting out of the presence of a king the way a servant leaves a throne room, which is exactly how that Hebrew wording gets used elsewhere. He was not trying to hide. He was quitting. Now the harbor. Joppa was the port, and it is worth knowing what kind of port it was, because it tells you something about how few options he had. That whole stretch of coast is straight and shallow and short on natural harbors. Joppa was the exception, and it was a bad exception. A line of rocks runs across the mouth of it, and ships had to thread a gap in the reef to get inside. In heavy weather, it was dangerous. It was also, for centuries, the only real harbor on that coast, which is why cedar for Solomon's temple came down the sea to Joppa, and why it stayed in use for thousands of years. He came down out of the hills to the one place with ships in it, and everything went smoothly. There was a vessel at the dock, loading, bound in exactly the direction he wanted. The timing worked. He had the fare, and the text mentions that he paid it, which is a small domestic detail the story did not have to include. Somebody let him aboard without a conversation about why a Hebrew prophet was booking passage to the end of the world. No angel in the gateway. No word from God on the dock telling him to turn around. No thunder. No delay. No lost purse. No ship that had already sailed. Every light was green. And this is the part worth being careful with, because it would be easy to turn it into a rule. And it is not a rule. Things going smoothly does not mean you are headed the wrong way. Sometimes, an open door is exactly what it looks like. The narrower thing this story shows is simpler than a rule and harder to argue with. The absence of resistance is not, by itself, information. Jonah got a ship, a berth, and a following wind out of the harbor, and he was still going the wrong direction, and the ease of it told him nothing at all. He walked up the plank with the whole afternoon in his favor. Then he went below, and that is where the story starts, using a particular verb, over and over. And once you have seen it, you cannot stop seeing it. Hebrew narrative repeats words on purpose. It is one of the main tools the language has. And a writer who wants you to notice something will put the same verb in your ear 3 or 4 times and let it do the work. The verb in this stretch of the story is yarad. It means to go down. He went down to Joppa. The village sat in the hill country, and the coast is at sea level. So, the first one is just geography. Anybody traveling from Gath Hepher to the harbor goes down. Nothing loaded about it yet. Then he found the ship, and he went down into it. Then, with the crew still working the lines and the harbor still in sight behind them, he went down again, into the hold, the innermost part of the vessel, as far below deck as the ship had room for, and there he lay down and fell into a dead sleep. 3 descents in about 2 verses. And the story is not finished with the word. In a few pages, he will be in the water, and he will describe himself going down to the roots of the mountains, to the very bottom of the sea, to the place where the bars of the earth closed behind him. Watch what happens to the size of his world while all of that is going on. He started with a country, hills, village, roads running in every direction. The whole open map of the ancient world, available to a man on foot. Then it was one ship, a hull maybe 50 or 60 feet long, if it was a typical Phoenician merchantman of the period, with a single square sail and a crew you could count. Then it was the hold of that ship, a dark space under the deck planks, packed with whatever they were hauling, jars of oil and wine stacked in rows, grain, bales, ballast stones down in the bilge, low enough that a grown man could not stand up straight in it, the smell of pitch and old water and the cargo itself, and on the other side of the planks, close enough to put his hand on, the sea. Then it would be the sea itself. Then it would be smaller still. The farther he ran, the less room he had. That is the shape of this whole chapter of the book. And the writer built it out of one repeated verb. Now the sleep. The word the text uses for it is not ordinary rest. It describes a heavy, unresponsive sleep, the kind a person does not surface from easily. It shows up when Adam is put under before the rib is taken, and when Saul's entire camp sleeps through, David walking among them and taking the spear from beside his head. That is the depth of it. A man in the bottom of a ship, out cold, while the vessel carries him west. And there is something worth saying about that sleep before we get to the weather, because it is easy to read it as guilt catching up with him or as some kind of collapse. The text gives no sign of that. It shows a man who made a decision, executed it cleanly, boarded a ship, went below, and slept better than he had in some time. Running, very rarely, feels like running while you are doing it. It feels like relief. It feels like the pressure finally coming off after weeks of carrying something you could not put down. And the first night after the decision is often the best sleep in the whole stretch. Most people who have walked away from something they knew they were supposed to do can tell you about that night. The trouble with that kind of peace is that it has nothing to do with whether you were right. Meanwhile, up on the deck, the crew were working the ship. Phoenician sailors, most likely, or a mixed crew out of the coastal towns, which is what you would expect on a westbound cargo run out of Joppa. Men who had done this route before. They had a passenger below with paid fare and no reason to think about him again until landfall. They knew this sea. They knew that the sailing season had limits and that the Mediterranean turns dangerous in the wrong months. And they knew what the sky looked like before it went bad. None of them saw this one coming, because the wind that hit that ship was not weather in the ordinary sense. The text is direct about it. The Lord hurled a great wind onto the sea. Hurled. It is a violent verb, the kind you use for throwing a spear. And the story is going to use it again in a minute for what happens to the cargo, and again for what happens to Jonah. So here is where the geography of the runaway ends up. He had put a hill country, a coastline, a harbor, a deck, and a cargo hold between himself and the assignment. He had bought the longest ticket available on the known map. He was 2,000 miles of open water away from having to look at Nineveh. And the sea he was crossing belonged to the one he was leaving. You can walk out of the direction God gave you. The distance does not do what you wanted it to do. The wind came down on them, out of nothing. Anyone who has been on the Mediterranean in a bad hour knows how fast that water changes character. It is a closed sea, and the storms in it come up short and steep, wave following wave with no distance between them. So a hull never gets the chance to recover before the next one lands. The ship was wood, sewn and pegged, riding low with a full load. It had one mast, one sail, steering oars off the stern quarter, and no way to run from anything. Green water came over the rail and stayed on deck. Cargo shifted below. The mast worked in its step with every roll, and the whole vessel groaned along its length in a way that told every man aboard exactly what was being asked of the timber. The text says the ship threatened to break up. The Hebrew is stranger and better. It says the ship thought about breaking apart, as though the vessel itself were considering whether to hold together. These were professional sailors on a route they knew. They were not new to weather. Every one of them was terrified. So they did the two things men do at that point. They started throwing the cargo over the side, which was their pay and their owner's investment and the entire point of the voyage. And they started praying, each one shouting into the wind to whatever god he had grown up with. Up on deck, every man aboard was calling out to heaven. Below the deck, the one man who knew its name was asleep. The cargo went over the side first. Understand what that meant to the men throwing it. A merchant run across the Mediterranean was a year of somebody's life. The oil and wine and grain in that hold had been bought on credit or fronted by an owner ashore. And the crew's pay came out of what arrived at the far end. Jettisoning the load was the standard move in a storm because a lighter hull rides higher. But nobody did it casually. Every jar that went into the water was money that was never coming back. And some of it belonged to men who would still owe for it when they got home. They threw it anyway, because they wanted to live. And while they were doing that, they were praying. The text says each man cried out to his own god, which tells you the crew came from several places, which is exactly what you would expect on that coast. Phoenician gods, Egyptian ones, whatever the men from the inland towns had grown up with, every one of them shouting a different name into the same wind. Then somebody realized they were one man short. The captain went below to find him. The Hebrew title for him is interesting. Something like chief of the rope pullers. A working man rather than an officer. The most experienced hand aboard. He climbed down into the hold in the middle of the worst weather of his career. And he found a passenger asleep on the boards. And what he said to him is one of the strangest sentences in the book. What do you mean? Sleeper, get up and call on your God. Maybe he will give us a thought so that we do not die. Get up, call out. Those are the same two verbs God used. The command that started this whole thing was get up, go to Nineveh, and cry out against it. Jonah walked away from that sentence, boarded a ship, and buried himself in the bottom of it. And the sentence came back down the ladder after him in the mouth of a sailor who had never heard of the God of Israel. The story does not point at this. It just sets it there. Up on deck, the storm was not letting up. And the crew did what people in the ancient world did when a situation stopped making natural sense. They cast lots. That practice shows up all over the ancient Mediterranean. And it shows up in Israel too. Stones or marked sticks or something similar, thrown or drawn, on the understanding that the outcome was not random and that the divine world would speak through it. It was not a game. It was how you asked a question that ordinary means could not answer. They asked whose fault this was. The lot fell on Jonah. Then the questions came at him fast, one on top of another. The way people talk when they are frightened and out of time. What do you do for a living? Where did you come from? What country? What people? He answered with a creed. I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. Every word of that is correct. It is the sort of confession you would want a prophet to make. He names his people. He names his God. And he identifies him as the maker of the very water they were being killed by. There is nothing wrong with his theology. There has never been anything wrong with his theology. He fears the Lord, he says. On a westbound ship, he boarded to get away from him, and the sailors were more afraid after hearing it than they had been before. The text says they were seized with a great fear, and they asked him a question that has an edge on it. What is this that you have done? They asked it that way because they already knew part of the answer. The narrator drops in a clarifying line at this point, a little out of sequence, and it is easy to skate past. The men knew he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. So at some point on that voyage, he had said it out loud. Maybe on the dock. Maybe over food the first evening. In the tone of a man mentioning that he was between jobs. Whatever it sounded like when he said it. It had meant nothing to them at the time. A passenger's private business. Now it meant everything. And they were standing in it. That is the thing about the cost in this chapter. It landed on men who had nothing to do with any of it. They had not heard the command. They had not been offered a vote. They had never met this man before the morning he walked up the plank with his fare in his hand. And now their cargo was on the bottom of the sea. Their ship was coming apart under them. And they were about to find out whether they would see their families again. Some of them had wives in Joppa or Tyre or Sidon who would have to be told something. Careful here, because it would be easy to turn this into a law. And it is not one. Not every wrong turn a person takes wrecks the people around them. And there are plenty of quiet failures that stay quiet. Anybody who tells you that every hard thing in your life traces back to somebody's disobedience is selling something. What this story shows is narrower and more believable than that. Decisions travel further than the person making them expects, and they usually reach people who were never consulted. Jonah bought one ticket. The whole crew paid for it. The sea kept getting worse while they were talking, and the crew put the practical question to him. What should we do to you to make the sea quiet down for us? Notice that they asked. They had the lot. They had his confession. They had a ship going down under their feet. And they still went to him and asked what to do. 12 or 15 frightened men and one passenger they could have thrown over the rail in about 4 seconds. And instead they held a conversation. His answer came back in one sentence. Pick me up and hurl me into the sea, and it will quiet down for you. I know that this great storm has come upon you because of me. Hurl. The same violent verb the story used when God hurled the wind onto the water. And when the sailors hurled the cargo over the side, he asked to be thrown the way the freight had been thrown. Now sit with what he did not say. He did not say, turn the ship around. He did not say, put me ashore anywhere on this coast, and I will start walking northeast. He did not ask them to wait while he prayed. And he did not offer to take back the decision that had put every man aboard in the water. The remedy he proposed was his own death. And here the story does something it does over and over, which is to leave a hole exactly where a modern reader wants an explanation. It does not tell you what he was thinking, not one word about his motive. So there are 2 readings, and both of them are serious. The generous one says, this is the first decent thing he does in the book. 12 men are about to drown for something that is entirely his doing. He knows it. And he offers the only exchange available. One life instead of all of them. Read that way. It is close to brave. The darker one says, look at what he still refuses. The storm has him cornered. The whole crew is watching. And the one option he will not put on the table is going where he was sent. He would rather go into the water than northeast. The text does not settle it. And anybody who tells you which one is correct has gone further than Jonah's own book was willing to go. The book will hand you his motive eventually, in his own words. But not here. Not for another 2 chapters. What you can say with confidence is smaller and still heavy enough. By this point in the story, his resistance had carried him past the coast, past the ship, past the cargo, past 12 men's lives, and out to the edge of his own. Whatever was driving that, it was not a mild preference. It had teeth. And then the sailors did something nobody would have predicted. They said no. The men had a confession, a lot that had fallen, and a volunteer, which in the ancient world is about as clear a set of instructions as a crew is ever going to get. The passenger himself had told them the solution. Every religious assumption they had was pointing the same direction. Instead, they went back to the oars and tried to row for land. The Hebrew verb there means to dig. And that is the picture. men digging into the water with everything they had left, taking a heavy merchant hull into a head, sea by muscle, trying to claw their way to a shoreline they probably could not even see. They were trying to save the man who had done this to them. It did not work. The text says the sea grew more and more stormy against them. And eventually every man on that deck understood that they were choosing between one death and all of them. But the rowing is in the story. And it did not have to be. The writer could have gone straight from the confession to the throw. Instead, there is a stretch of time where a crew of foreign sailors, soaked and exhausted and financially ruined, broke their backs trying to spare a Hebrew prophet the consequence he had asked for. Hold that image for a second before the next thing happens. Because of everyone on that ship, the man who knew the most about God was doing the least about it. Then the sea took another one over the rail, and the oars came in. Before they put their hands on him, they prayed, not to their own gods this time. Every man on that deck had already tried those, back when the cargo was going over the side, and the wind had answered by getting worse. This prayer went somewhere else. They called out to the Lord. The Hebrew has the name here, the personal name of the God of Israel, the one Jonah had given them a few minutes earlier when he told them who he was. These men had it in their mouths within the hour, and what they said is worth hearing in full, because it is the most careful sentence anybody speaks in the first half of this book. Please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us guilty of innocent blood. You are the Lord, and you have done as you pleased. Read that again slowly, because there is a lot inside it. They were about to throw a man into the sea, and they wanted it on the record that they did not want to. They asked not to be charged with his blood, which means they were thinking about blood guilt. The idea that a killing leaves a stain on the people who did it and has to be answered for. That concept sits at the center of Israelite law. These men were not Israelites. They had known the name of this God for about 10 minutes, and their first instinct was to treat a human life as something that would have to be accounted for. And the last line is the one that lands hardest. You are the Lord, and you have done as you pleased. That is a statement of sovereignty, spoken in the middle of the worst hour of their lives, by sailors, in a storm, with no theological training whatsoever. The prophet on that deck had not said anything remotely like it since he came aboard. Then they picked him up and put him into the sea, and the water went still. The text does not describe a slow easing. It says the sea ceased from its raging, and the way it is written suggests it happened right then, in the space of a breath. A wind that had been trying to kill 12 men for hours simply stopped, and the surface came down, and the ship was suddenly rolling on ordinary water, with the deck a wreck and the hold empty and one passenger gone. Now look at what the crew did next. Because this is the part almost nobody remembers about the first chapter of Jonah. They feared the Lord with a great fear. Those are the words. And then they offered a sacrifice to him and made vows. They worshipped on a stripped ship in the middle of the sea, with no altar and no priest and no idea what they were doing. Some of them almost certainly making promises they would spend years figuring out how to keep whatever they had walked aboard believing. They were not going home with it. That is where the first chapter of the book of Jonah ends. Not with the prophet, with a boatload of pagan sailors in an act of worship. Sit with the arrangement of that. In this chapter, the men who did not know God prayed, threw away their livelihoods to save lives, refused to take a life until there was no other option, rowed themselves to exhaustion, trying to protect the man who had endangered them, asked for mercy on his behalf, acknowledged God's right to do as he pleased, and finished by making vows to him. The man who did know God slept, and then asked to be thrown overboard. The book never comments on it. There is no line of narration pointing it out. No aside. No moral. The writer just lays the two behaviors side by side in the same chapter and moves on to the fish. And if you are reading quickly, you will not even notice what you have been shown. We are going to see this again. It is going to happen with a city, and with a king, and eventually with a plant, and a worm and a wind. The last thing we know about those sailors is that they were alive, and that they had a story they would be telling for the rest of their lives about a passenger out of Joppa. They never learned what happened to him. He went into the water in the open sea. There was nothing under him. That is worth stopping on, because the whole scene depends on it. This was not a swimmer near a beach. The ship had been running west for at least a day, probably more, and had been driven who knows where by the storm. Whatever coastline existed was over the horizon in a direction he could not have identified. Mediterranean water in the sailing season is warm enough that cold would not have taken him fast, which in this case means the end would have come slower rather than easier. A man in the water without a hull to hold on to swims until he cannot. And then he stops swimming. He had roughly the length of time his arms would hold out. Not longer. And then the story says the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Let us go slowly here, because this is the single most famous sentence in the book, and almost everything the average person carries around about it comes from somewhere other than the text. Start with the animal. The Hebrew is dag gadol, great fish. That is all it says. The word dag is the ordinary word for fish, and gadol is the ordinary word for big, and there is no species anywhere in the sentence. The whale came in later, through Greek and then through English. The Greek text of Matthew uses kydos, which is a broad word for a large sea creature, and English translators for a long time rendered it whale. And the whale stuck. It got into children's books and stained glass and cartoons in the phrase Jonah and the whale, which is now more famous than the book it comes from. The Hebrew does not say whale. It also does not say shark, and it does not say anything else. Whatever swims through this story, the writer declined to identify it. And going further than he did is not being faithful to the text. It is adding to it. Which brings up the thing people usually reach for next. There is a story that circulates constantly in sermons and forwarded emails about a sailor named James Bartley, who was supposedly swallowed by a sperm whale off the Falkland Islands in the 1890s and cut out alive a day or 2 later. Bleached white by stomach acid but breathing. The story is not true. Researchers went and checked. The ship named in the account, the Star of the East, was not a whaler. Crew records and the vessel's own history do not match the tale. The captain's wife, tracked down years afterward, said there had never been a man overboard on that voyage, and no such incident had happened. The account has been traced back through newspaper reprints, and appears to have started as a piece of fiction that got repeated until it acquired a date and a name. And the reason to bring it up at all is not to score a point. It is that reaching for it gives away something. If the Bartley story were the load-bearing evidence, then the entire episode would depend on whether a whale can hold a man, and the book of Jonah would rise or fall on marine biology. That is not the claim the text makes. The text says God appointed the fish. That word, appointed, is doing all the work. And the story uses it 3 more times before the end for 3 other things. The book is not offering a natural mechanism. It never was. So set the species question down, because it is not the interesting question. Here is the interesting question. What is the fish for? Everybody remembers it as the punishment. That is how it gets told. He disobeyed, so God had him swallowed. And the belly of the fish is the consequence. The dark place, the sentence he served. Run the sequence again. He asked to go into the water. That was his own proposal, offered to the crew as the solution to the storm. The sea was where the story was going to end, and by every ordinary reckoning it should have. 12 sailors watched a man go over the rail into deep water miles from anywhere, and they went home certain of what had happened to him. And they were right to be. The fish is the reason he did not drown. The sea was the death he chose. The fish is what would not let him have it. Read the prayer that comes next, and he says as much himself. He describes the water closing over him, the deep surrounding him, weeds wrapped around his head, going down to the roots of the mountains. He talks about the pit. He was not rescued from the fish. He was rescued by it, out of the thing he had asked for. That is a considerably stranger picture than the one on the Sunday school felt board. And it is the one the book actually gives you. Whatever else is going on inside that animal, mercy is in there with him. And there is one more thing in the sentence. Quiet, easy to walk past. And it belongs to a pattern this book has been building since the first chapter. The Lord appointed a great fish, and it came. Nobody negotiated with it. There is no scene where the fish considers the assignment, weighs the risk, thinks about what it would cost, and heads the other way. It was told, and it did. The sea got a command and obeyed it. The wind got one and obeyed it. Now a fish. The list is going to get longer. 3 days and 3 nights. The text says, and it does not tell you one thing about what that was like. No description of the dark, no smell, no sound, no account of what a man thinks about in there. The book of Jonah has no interest in the experience. It only records what he said. The second chapter of the book is a poem. The narrative stops. The prose gives way to Hebrew verse. And for about 8 lines you are inside the man's own words. It is the only extended thing Jonah says in the entire book until the very end. And it is the reason a lot of readers walk away from the story thinking they watched a man break and come back. Read it carefully, and it does not say what people remember it saying. Start with the tense, because it is the first surprise. This is not a cry for help. It is a thanksgiving psalm. And the verbs are almost all in the past. I called out to the Lord in my distress, and he answered me. From the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. You brought my life up from the pit. The rescue is described as something already finished, spoken by a man who is, at that moment, still inside the fish, which is a strange and interesting thing for the book to record. He is thanking God for a deliverance he has not visibly received yet. Whatever else is going on in this poem, he decided somewhere in that dark that the drowning had already been stopped. Then look at where the language comes from. Almost every line of it is borrowed. The waters closed in over me. The deep surrounded me. Your breakers and your waves passed over me. I have been driven from your sight. My life was fainting away. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Those phrases and their close cousins are scattered through the Psalms. This poem is stitched together from the Songbook of Israel, the material a Hebrew boy would have heard in worship his whole life. The lines that get into a person, the way old hymns get into people who have not been inside a church in 20 years. He did not compose something new down there. Nobody does. That is worth 4 sentences, and no more. Because it is the one genuinely useful thing in this chapter, and it does not need a sermon attached. Under real pressure, people do not invent a new interior life. They reach for whatever was already put in them, years earlier, usually without noticing it was being put there. What comes up in the dark is what went in during daylight. Jonah had psalms in him, and that is what came out. He also uses the word Sheol, which is the Hebrew term for the realm of the dead. And he uses temple imagery. I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you, to your holy temple, a man at the bottom of the sea. thinking about a building in Jerusalem. So the poem is beautiful. It is soaked in scripture, and it ends on a line that could be carved over a door. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Now here is where the chapter turns, and it turns on what is missing. Two things are not in this prayer, and once you notice them, you cannot read it the same way again. The first thing missing is repentance. Go through it, line by line. He describes his situation in detail. He describes the water, the weeds, the depth, the fainting, the pit. He credits God with the rescue. He promises to sacrifice and to pay what he has vowed, which is the language of a man discharging an obligation. He never says he was wrong. There is no confession anywhere in it. No, I disobeyed. No, I refused what you asked. No apology to the God he walked away from. And nothing that acknowledges the ship, or the storm, or the cargo, or the 12 men who nearly died because of him. He mentions being driven from God's sight, but he says it as something that happened to him rather than something he bought a ticket for. The one line that comes closest is about people who cling to worthless idols and forsake the mercy that could be theirs. And he says it about other people, in a prayer offered inside a fish, by a man who fled a direct command. The only sin named belongs to somebody else. That is the first gap. Here is the second, and it is bigger. Nineveh is not in this prayer. Not the name of it. Not a reference to it. Not a hint. The command that started all of this. The assignment he was given and refused. The city, 500 miles northeast, with the thing God told him to say to it, does not appear anywhere in the only speech he makes in the first half of the book. He talks about the sea and the depths and the temple and his own life and his own vows. He never mentions the one subject the entire crisis was about. He is at the absolute bottom, in the strangest place any human being has ever prayed from, and he still will not say the name of the city. Now, be careful with this, because it would be easy to swing too far. This is not a case for calling the prayer fake. The gratitude in it reads as real. The man is glad to be alive, and he says so. And there is no reason to doubt him. Plenty of readers across 2,000 years have taken this chapter as a genuine turning point. And they are not fools for reading it that way. The narrower point is simply that the poem does less than it appears to do. Being grateful for a rescue is not the same thing as changing your mind about the thing you were rescued from. Those two can live in the same person at the same time. And in this man they did. And you do not have to guess about that, which is the whole reason this chapter matters. The book itself settles it. 2 chapters from now, in the last scene, he is going to tell us, in plain words, what he thought about the assignment all along. And it will be exactly what he thought when he bought the ticket. Nothing in the fish changed his mind. It changed his location. Then the poem ends, and the narrative picks back up in a single flat sentence. And the timing of it is the last thing worth noticing here. The Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto the dry land. Not before the prayer. After it, the book of Jonah is very interested in the order of events. And this order says something. Whatever that poem was, incomplete as it was, evasive as it was on the one subject that mattered, God took it as enough to work with. He did not wait for a better prayer. He was on a beach. The text will not tell you which one. No coastline named. No distance from anywhere. No indication of how far the fish had carried him, or in what direction. He was somewhere on dry land. Alone. And the story does not say a single word about what condition he was in, or how long he lay there before he could stand up. There were no witnesses. Nobody came down the shore and found him. The one man in the world who could confirm any of this had been thrown off a ship and was presumed drowned by everyone who knew his name. And that is where the third chapter of the book opens. And it opens with a phrase that is worth building a whole chapter around. The word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. A second time. Stop on it. The book could have said the word of the Lord came to Jonah. It says a second time. Deliberately. Because the writer wants you to hear it against the first time. And because everything in that gap needs accounting for. Look at what sat between those two moments. A refusal. A journey to the coast in the wrong direction. A ticket purchased to the far end of the world. A ship full of men who lost their cargo and nearly lost their lives. A storm. A confession that did not include an apology. A request to be thrown into the sea. 3 days inside an animal. A prayer with a hole in the middle of it where the city should have been. That is what a second time is measured against. Now read what the voice actually said. Get up. Go to Nineveh, that great city, and proclaim to it the message that I tell you. Get up. Go to Nineveh, that great city. Those are the same words. Same verb. Same city. Same phrasing as chapter 1. Near enough that a listener would catch it immediately. The commission comes back essentially unchanged, as though the previous 3 chapters had not occurred. And notice everything that is not in that sentence. There is no rebuke, not a line of it, no reminder of what he did, no accounting of the sailors, no mention of the storm, or the fair, or the fish. God does not open with a summary of the offense, which is what almost any human being would do, and what most of us expect the text to do. There is no probation either. Nobody says, you will need to prove yourself first. Nobody says, I will find somebody else for this, and you can watch. Nobody says you had your chance. And there is no discussion. The word came. And it came in the imperative. And it came about the same city. The assignment did not expire while he was running from it. That is the plainest sentence in this whole story. And it is worth sitting still for 4 sentences and no more. Most people who have walked away from something they believed they were supposed to do carry a quiet certainty that the door closed behind them, and that whatever it was has been handed to somebody else by now. It is a reasonable assumption. And this book does not support it. The command that came the second time was the same command. To the same man. About the same city. What the running cost him was time, and a ship's cargo, and nearly the lives of 12 men. It did not cost him the assignment. One thing to be careful about, because it would be easy to walk out of this chapter with too much in your hands. This is not a promise that every opportunity waits indefinitely for everybody. The book of Jonah is telling you about one man and one city, and stretching it into a guarantee would be doing something the text does not do. What it does show, without any qualification at all, is that the God in this story came back to a man who had already said no in the most expensive way available, and gave him the same job again, with no conditions attached and no reference to what had happened. And then, for the first time in the book, Jonah did what he was told. The text records it in 7 words. So Jonah got up and went to Nineveh, according to the word of the Lord. He got up. Notice which verb that is. It is the same one from the command. Get up, God said. Twice now. This time the man got up. He had a long walk in front of him, and no supplies mentioned anywhere. And the direction was northeast, which meant every step of it was in the exact direction he had bought a ticket to avoid. The walk was the first punishment nobody talks about, whatever beach he came ashore on. The road ran northeast, and there was a lot of it. Up the coast, inland, through Syria, across to the Euphrates, then the long eastern haul toward the Tigris. The practical routes ran something like 500 miles, and merchants and caravans made that trip regularly. So it was not exotic. It was just long. Figure a month of walking, give or take, for a man moving steadily. Longer if he was in bad shape. And there is no reason to think he was in good shape. Nights in caravan stops, or in the open. Water where he could find it. Dust in everything. And a month of walking is a month of thinking. With nothing to do but put the ground behind him and consider what he was going to say when he got there. The country changed under his feet as he went. Coastal towns first. Then the inland hills. Then the Syrian steppe. Then, eventually, the river country. Irrigation canals cut in straight lines. Fields worked in a pattern nobody in Galilee would have recognized. Assyrian soldiers on the roads. Assyrian money in the markets. The empire got denser around him with every week. Then the city. The book says Nineveh was an exceedingly great city. A visit of 3 days. Nobody is entirely sure what that phrase means. It might describe a walking circuit of the urban area. It might include the surrounding towns and administrative district. And it might be a way of saying that dealing with the place properly took 3 days of a person's time. The way we say a 2-week job. Ancient measurements do not translate cleanly. And the numbers in this book get argued about. What is not in doubt is that this was a major city of the ancient world. On a river. Walled. With a palace and temples in it. And that a man from a village in the Galilee had never seen anything like it. So he went in. And here is what he said. 40 more days. And Nineveh will be overthrown. That is it. That is the entire recorded message. In Hebrew it is 5 words. 5 words. After a 500-mile walk. From a man who had crossed an empire to deliver them. Look at what is not in that sentence. Because the absences are the whole point. He does not name God. Not once. He does not say who sent him. He does not use the divine name. And he does not say, "Thus says the Lord," which is the standard opening every prophet in the Hebrew Bible uses when he wants his audience to know where the message came from. A crowd hearing this would have to guess which God was being talked about. He does not name the crime either. No list of offense. No accusation. No mention of the violence that the first chapter said had come up before God. The city is not told what it did. And there is no way out offered. No, if you turn. No, unless you change. No, therefore, repent. Nothing in that sentence suggests that anything could be done about it. He announces a countdown and walks on. It is the shortest sermon in the Bible. And it may also be the most hopeless one. No sender. No charge. No remedy. Just a deadline. Whether he shortened it on purpose is not something the text will tell you. And it is worth resisting the urge to decide. What can be said is that a man who wanted a city to survive would probably have said more. Now the one word in it that is doing real work. The Hebrew verb is a form of hapek, and translations render it overthrown. It carries that meaning, and it is the verb used for what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. So an ancient audience would have heard destruction in it immediately. But hapek has a second range. It means to turn something over, to flip it, to change it into something else. It is used for a heart being changed, and for mourning being turned into dancing, and for water being turned into blood. 40 more days, and Nineveh will be overturned. The same word covers both endings. Flattened, or flipped, destroyed, or transformed. Nobody standing in that street heard a double meaning. They heard a threat, and they were meant to. But the sentence the book put in his mouth is capable of both outcomes at once. And by the end of the chapter, one of them will have happened while everyone in the city was bracing for the other. Leave it there. The book does not explain it, and neither will we. 40 days, he said, which is the same number the Bible uses over and over for a stretch of testing with an end on it. Rain on the ark, Moses on the mountain, Israel scouting the land. A man in the wilderness, a long time later. 40 days is not a sentence being carried out. It is a window. So the message went into the streets of Nineveh. From a foreign man in worn clothes, who had come a very long way to say almost nothing. And what happened next has no parallel anywhere in the prophetic books. Turn the camera around and stand in the crowd for this part. Because the story stops being about Jonah for a while. And the book seems to want it that way. The text says the people of Nineveh believed God. Not believed Jonah. Believed God. Which is striking given that he never said the name. And it is the first thing that happens after the message goes out. Before anything is organized. Before any official hears about it. Before a single order comes down from anywhere. The ordinary people in that city took it seriously. Then they fasted. And they put on sackcloth. From the greatest of them to the least. Sackcloth was coarse, dark cloth. Goat hair usually. Uncomfortable against skin on purpose. It was the standard ancient signal of mourning and grief across that entire region. Nobody had to explain it to anybody. You saw a man in the street wearing it and you knew what it meant. And if you saw a whole city wearing it, you knew something had happened. And the phrase, from the greatest to the least, is doing something. It means the merchants and the officials, and the household servants, and the laborers. All of it. Top to bottom. Without waiting for permission. The report reached the king after the fact. Read that sequence again. Because it is unusual and easy to miss. The city moved first. The palace found out about it and joined in. Whatever this was, it was not imposed from above. The book does not give the king's name. That silence is worth pausing on for one line. Because it is the kind of thing people try to fill in. Various proposals have been made about which Assyrian ruler this might have been. And the arguments depend on chronologies that are themselves debated. The text withholds the name. And nothing in this story depends on recovering it. What the text gives instead is a sequence of physical actions. And they are all downward. He got up from his throne. He took off his royal robe. He covered himself with sackcloth. And he sat down in the ashes. The throne, then the ground. Think about who that is. This is the ruler of the empire, whose kings put their conquests on their palace walls in first person. Who had themselves carved, receiving tribute from kneeling foreign kings. Whose entire political theology was built on the idea that they were the instrument of the god Ashur and could not be resisted. That office did not do humility as a public gesture. There was no upside in it. He sat in ashes. Then came the decree, and it was issued in his name and the name of his nobles. And it is stranger than the sitting. Let neither man nor beast, herd nor flock, taste anything. Do not let them eat, or drink water. Let man and beast be covered with sackcloth. The animals. Every commentator on this book has had to deal with that line, and there is no way to make it sound normal. Livestock in sackcloth, kept from food and water along with the people. Some readers have taken it as a sign that the book has a streak of dark humor running through it. Herodotus records a Persian mourning practice involving animals. So the idea was not unheard of in that part of the world. Whatever else it is to tell. The king does not want anything in that city eating while this plays out. Then, the last part of the decree, which is the part that matters. Let everyone turn from his evil way and from the violence that is in his hands. The violence that is in his hands. Nobody told them that. Jonah's 5 words did not include a charge. The first chapter said their wickedness had come up before God. But Jonah never repeated it in the street. And the king names it anyway. He knew exactly what his city was guilty of. And he said it out loud in an official document. And the word he chose is the one for violence. The man running the most violent empire in the region put in writing that the problem was the violence. And then the final line of the decree. And it is the most honest sentence any character speaks in this book. Who knows? God may turn and relent, and turn from his fierce anger, so that we do not perish. Who knows? He had no promise. Jonah had not offered one. There was no covenant here. No history with this God. No scripture. No priesthood. No assurance of any kind. The message they received was a countdown with no exit written into it. And a whole city acted anyway, on nothing but a maybe. Now set two things next to each other and say nothing about it. Jonah had a direct command, delivered in the divine name, from the God of his own nation, whose word he had carried before and seen come true in public. It took a refusal, a voyage, a storm, a lottery, 12 men rowing for their lives, a plunge into open sea, 3 days inside a fish, and a second command to get him to the city. Nineveh had 5 words from a stranger who did not say who sent him. They needed one afternoon. The book records what happened next in one flat sentence, and it does not decorate it. God saw what they did, that they turned from their evil way, and God relented from the disaster he had said he would bring, and he did not do it. The 40 days ran out. Nothing came. The city stood. The people took off the sackcloth eventually and went back to work. And somewhere out in the streets was a foreign prophet who had walked 500 miles, delivered a message to an enemy capital, and watched the entire population turn, from the throne down to the livestock, by any professional standard in the ancient world. That is the most successful day any prophet ever had. Isaiah was told at his commissioning that his people would not listen. Jeremiah preached for 40 years and watched his city burn. Ezekiel was told to his face that Israel would not hear him. Jonah said 5 words, and an empire's capital city went to its knees. He walked out of the city, sat down on a hill east of it, and wanted to die. So we are back where we started. A man on a slope east of the city, out past the wall, in the heat, watching a place that is still standing. The book puts his reaction in one line, and the Hebrew is blunter than most translations manage. It says the thing was evil to Jonah, a great evil, and he burned. That word evil is the same root the book has been using all along. It is the word for the wickedness of Nineveh in the first chapter, the thing that came up before God. It is the word for the disaster God said he would bring and then did not bring. And now it is the word for what Jonah felt when the city was spared. The same term, 3 times, for 3 completely different things. The city's violence, the judgment, and a prophet's reaction to mercy. Then he prayed, and the prayer is the moment this entire book has been holding back. He starts by asking a question that only makes sense if you have been waiting for it. Is this not what I said when I was still in my own country? Still in my own country, before Joppa, before the fair, before the ship, before he ever went down that hill toward the coast. He is telling us that there was a conversation we were never shown, back at the beginning, and that everything he is about to say now. He said then, "That is why I fled to Tarshish." There it is. The reason. 14 chapters of a man refusing to explain himself. And he explains himself in one clause. And then he gives the reason itself. And it is not what anybody expects. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and one who relents from sending disaster. Read that again and let it be as strange as it is. He did not run because he doubted God. He ran because he was certain of him. He was not afraid the mission would fail. He was afraid it would work. Everything he did, the ticket and the ship and the sleep in the hold and the request to be thrown into the sea, came out of a fear that he would deliver the message, and the city would turn, and God would forgive them, which is exactly what happened. He was right about all of it, start to finish. Now look at the sentence he used. Because he did not make it up. That description of God comes from the book of Exodus, from the scene where Moses is on the mountain and asks to see God's glory. And God passes by in front of him and says his own name and then describes himself. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. That formula is one of the oldest confessional statements in the Hebrew Bible. It shows up again in the Psalms, in Joel, in Nehemiah, in Numbers. It was quoted at feasts. It is how Israel said out loud what their God was like. It is a comfort. It is the thing you tell your children. Jonah quotes it accurately. He does not twist a word of it. He quotes it as a complaint. The central creed about the character of God. The sentence his own people leaned on when there was nothing else to lean on. And he throws it back at heaven as the charge sheet. This is what you are like. That is the problem. I knew you would do this. And he adds a phrase to it that Exodus does not have. One who relents from sending disaster. He is not just describing God's mercy in the abstract. He is naming the specific act that just took place in front of him. And he is filing it as a grievance. Now hold on to what we learned back in the 3rd chapter. Because this is where it earns its place. The people he wanted destroyed were not strangers to him. Assyria had been taking tribute out of his region for a century. An Assyrian monument shows a king of the northern kingdom face down on the ground. The empire whose capital he had just walked through advertised what it did to captured cities by carving it on palace walls. And Jonah's own country was next. He may not have known the year, but he did not need to. Anybody with eyes on that border understood which direction the weight was moving. Within a few generations of that hillside, Assyrian armies would take the Galilee, deport the population in waves, put Samaria under a 3-year siege, and end the northern kingdom permanently. His village went early, so the man on that hill was not angry about an abstraction. He believed that the city God had just spared was the city that would erase his people. And he was correct. This is the uncomfortable part, and there is no honest way around it. His fear was rational. His arithmetic was sound. Every fact he had was accurate, including his theology, which was flawless from the first page of this book to the last. He was a prophet with a proven record who correctly identified the character of God and correctly identified the threat to his nation. And he still ended up on a hillside outside an enemy capital, furious that it was still standing. Then he says the last thing in the prayer. Now, Lord, please take my life from me, because it is better for me to die than to live. Twice in this book he is asked to die rather than accept what God was doing. Once in a storm, once on a hill. Both times the alternative on the table was mercy for Nineveh. And God answers him with one sentence. And it is a question. Is it right for you to be angry? That is all. No rebuke. No lecture. No correction of his theology, which did not need correcting. A question, handed to a man sitting in the dirt. Jonah does not answer it. Here is the thing this whole story has been walking toward. And it takes 4 sentences. And then we go to the plant. He obeyed. Understand that clearly. Because it is easy to lose in the anger. He got up. He walked 500 miles. He went into a hostile city alone. And he delivered the message he was given. And a city was saved because he did. His feet went where God sent them. And none of it touched what he actually thought about those people. You can carry out the assignment and stay exactly who you were when you refused it. Getting his body to Nineveh took a storm, a fish, and a second command from heaven. Getting his heart there was a different trip. And at the end of the book, it has not been made. He did not go home. The city had been spared. The 40 days were up. The message had been delivered and answered. and there was nothing left for him to do there. He could have started walking west. Instead, he went out of the city and sat down east of it, and made himself a shelter, and sat under it in the shade to see what would become of the city, which tells you something. 40 days had already passed. There was nothing left to see. He built a booth on a hillside and sat down anyway, in the heat of northern Mesopotamia, in the dry season, waiting for a judgment that had already been called off. Then the book does one last thing, and it does it 3 times. The Lord God appointed a plant, and it came up over Jonah, to be a shade over his head and save him from his discomfort. Appointed. It is the same verb the story used for the fish. The plant is called a kikayon, and that word appears exactly once in the entire Hebrew Bible. Right here. Nobody knows for certain what it was. The old guesses run from a castor oil plant to a gourd vine, and translators have gone back and forth for centuries. It grew fast. It had broad leaves, and it made shade. And the book says Jonah was exceedingly glad about the plant. That is the only time in 4 chapters that this man is happy. Not when the storm stopped. Not when he was pulled out of the sea alive. Not when an entire city turned and lived. A vine grows over his head and he is delighted. Then, at dawn the next day, God appointed a worm, and it attacked the plant, and the plant withered. Appointed again. And when the sun rose, God appointed a scorching east wind. 3 appointments in about 4 verses. And the same verb that sent the fish. Anybody who has spent a summer in that part of the world knows the wind he means. It comes off the desert, dry and hot, loaded with dust, and it does not cool at night. It takes the moisture out of your eyes and your throat. Under that wind, with no shade, a man sitting on an exposed hillside is in real trouble within hours. The sun beat down on his head, and he grew faint, and he asked to die again. It is better for me to die than to live. 3rd time in the book, and God asks him the same question he asked before, with one word added. Is it right for you to be angry about the plant? And this time Jonah answers, it is right for me to be angry. Angry enough to die. Now stop for a moment and count what has happened in this book, because it has been building since the 1st chapter, and nobody in the story ever names it. God said to a storm, go, and it went. He said to the sea, be still, and it went still. He appointed a fish, and the fish came, and swallowed a man, and carried him, and put him on a beach when it was told to. He sent a message to a city, and the city turned. He spoke through a decree to a king, and the king came off his throne and sat in ash. He appointed a plant, and it grew overnight. He appointed a worm, and it did its work in a morning. He appointed a wind, and the wind blew. Sailors who had never heard his name feared him within the hour. Livestock got put in sackcloth. A worm obeyed. In the entire book, exactly 1 character says no, and he is the one who was called by name. From a village God knew, in a nation that had his word in writing. The book never points at this. It is just there, the whole way through. Once you have seen it, then God speaks for the last time, and the book ends inside his question. You had compassion on the plant, for which you did not labor, and which you did not grow, which came into being in a night and perished in a night. And should I not have compassion on Nineveh, that great city, in which there are more than 120,000 people who do not know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle? Look at what he uses. Not a doctrine, not the covenant, not the law, not a word about obedience or duty. A plant. He takes the one thing Jonah cared about in 4 chapters and holds it up next to a city. You are grieving a vine you did not plant, that you did not water, that grew in a night and died in a night. And you would like me to explain my concern for 120,000 people. That phrase about the right hand and the left has been read different ways. Some take it to mean small children. Others take it as a description of moral ignorance. People who genuinely did not know what they were doing. Either way, it is God describing the population of the most feared city in the region as people who did not know any better. And then the last 4 words of the book, and also much cattle. The final line in the book of Jonah is about livestock. God ends his own closing argument by mentioning the animals. Then it stops. There is no answer. Jonah does not reply. And nobody records whether he sat there, or got up, or went home, or ever spoke to God again. The book asks a question and then it simply ends. Mid-air. With the prophet on a hillside, and the question still in the room. Not one other book in the Hebrew Bible ends like that. We spend a lot of time thinking we are running from something hard. Jonah went all the way around. The ship and the storm, and the fish, and the road, and the city, and ended up on a hill outside a place that was still standing, and found out that the thing he had been running from was never the work. The last question in his book was never answered. It is still sitting there, open, waiting on whoever is listening.